We're live. Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. This is a place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain that which is most truthful and logically consistent. And today we're having a very awesome guest in the person of Professor Robert Cherry. And we're going to be talking on welfare, we're going to be talking on socioeconomic outcomes as it relates to welfare. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the African American community and seeing what the impact of welfare has been on them. But before we begin, I would just like to give a brief introduction of Professor Cherry. Professor Cherry is a professor emeritus at Brooklyn College with a PhD in economics from Kansas State University, received in 1968. His main areas of interest include race and gender earning disparities in America, issues of poverty, low income housing, tax reform to benefit working families, domestic relations, and immigration. He has written extensively on the subject of discrimination and race. Some of his selected works include Moving Forward, Third Way Policies That Work, Kaplan University and the Shortchanging of Minority Women, Discrimination, Its Economic Impact on Blacks, Women, and Jews, Welfare Transformed, Universalizing Family Policies That Work in 2007. Professor Cherry, welcome to Critical African Thinkers.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for agreeing to talk with us. This conversation. I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for quite a while, and I'm glad that this conversation is happening right now. So, Professor Sherry, my first question to you would be, what got you interested in talking? What got you interested in race and gender earning disparities, the economics of race and gender earning disparities? What got you interested in that particular one in the first place?
Well, I'm a child of the 60s. I went to college in the 1960s, and I was taken up in a kind of revolutionary order. And I belonged to a Leninist party that saw Black workers as the vanguard of revolutionary change. Uh, so, in my capacity as an economist, I began to do studies to look at the situation of Black workers, issues of discrimination, of poverty. And, I've basically done that for the last 45, 50 years. Uh, I'm, I moved away from uh, this communist vision, but I still think I remain true to a commitment to moving working class people forward. Uh, and my writings more recently uh, are on particularly the racial aspects of that.
Okay, that's interesting. So the 60s, you said you were a product of the 60s. What was unique about the 60s that we don't have right now? How is that time a different time
Well,
from
I think one of the
current
things
age?
was there was much more of a class perspective that almost, I would say, the majority of people who were on the left and certainly the revolutionary left were people who took inspiration from the trade union movement and working class struggles as a whole. Uh, I think Bernie Sanders, for example, is a child of that. And he's still, like, he's had to accommodate to identity politics somewhat. But, with his commitment to fighting the richest 1% and other things, he still tries to hold on to a kind of class perspective on things. And so I think that's what's changed. There certainly were people in the 60s who were not class driven. And I would say now there's very few people on the left who are under 50 who are class driven. They're driven by race, by gender. Doesn't make them bad, but it's a whole different kind of perspective than what
Mm.
I grew up with.
Yeah,
I
times
mean,
are really, really
my
changing.
grandparents were, in the garment industry. I was the first one in my extended family to go to college, so, and I wasn't unusual in the 60s. A lot of the people who went to college and became professors in the 60s came from a working class background. That's not true now. You look at academics, the people who've gotten PhDs in the last 20 years, the vast majority, particularly white, but the vast majority come from professional backgrounds. It's just much different.
So what's going on there? Is the working class family being decimated? Is it being destroyed such that um, that isn't the case right now? What's happening?
Well, there's certainly, um, in the United States, two out of every three college graduates are women. So there's been this attack on the working class shows up much more in terms of men and their inability to adapt to an economy that no longer values physical labor. There just aren't jobs. And even if you get a job in manufacturing, you're working with skilled machinery. Maybe construction is the one area where there's a reasonable amount of physical labor, but most and this is in the United States now. Manufacturing in China, in El Salvador, in less developed countries, is still pretty manual and pretty exhausting. But you don't have that anymore. So men have not been able to adapt to the new environment nearly as much as women who go into social services and a range of things. Uh, and, there's very little consideration of that. You still find that when people talk about gender, it's still looking for areas in which women have not succeeded, the glass ceiling. So there's a lot of areas where women are still not in leadership positions. And there are STEM areas where they're not even numerically as substantial as one might want. And so there continues to be an awful lot of energy around rectifying those remaining disparities where women are on the wrong side of it. But, you got all these men who are just on the wayside. And it's obviously much worse for black men. But, this whole opioid crisis was white men. It wasn't black men. So it it's just unfortunate that there's a constellation of politics that doesn't want to look at this kind of situation of men, because it doesn't fit into the white supremacy narrative, and it certainly doesn't fit into gender narratives. So there, there's just very little even interest in discussing these questions.
So it seems as if men are being left behind. Is this on purpose? Is this by design? Is this to, in quotes, take down the patriarchy, or what is this about?
I don't think that there was any concerted effort. It really was this collapse of traditional male categories, heavy manufacturing, mining. There were a range of industries in which strength was needed. And there's less and less of that. And I don't think there was any attempt to discourage men from getting education, uh, but they just weren't wired to this kind of change. And it's also that it once you get to the Midwest areas in the South and and away from the coast, you had these industrial towns that have just collapsed. Now Detroit has collapsed, Pittsburgh has collapsed. The cities that used to be manufacturing hubs are now what are called ed and med. Their revival has been educational services, colleges, and medical complexes. So you have a whole bunch of cities that look like they're doing okay for the professional class, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, but it's just been hollowed out, those cities, where if you're not an education or a medical professional, you're a service worker. It's in some way, uh, and it's nobody planned it, but nobody's doing anything to rectify it either. So it's kind of laissez-faire policy, uh, that's just
Could it
leading to this kind of gap between male attainment and female attainment.
could it be that the men are not adaptable enough? They have not developed their capacities to fit in and find relevance in the 21st century? Could that be just men's fault and not anybody's fault or any system's fault? I mean, you have to be able to change with the times and try and find
I
your
I
relevance.
know, but men are wired differently than women. I'm not. Am I allowed to say that? Will I get canceled? But you see it with kids. I mean, 2-year-old kid boys play with trucks. So you have a certain wiring. Their academic development is delayed. They're not as reading ready in the first grade as girls. There's a certain wiring, and reading, particularly reading, is, there's a gap. And if there was much more conscious now in the professional class in the United States, there are a number of parents who delay their sons going into school. Instead of going in at 5.5, 6 to the first grade, they keep them back and they go in when they're 6.5. That's not unusual among the professional class. So, there are things that could be done in the educational environment, but they're not, because the focus is on girls.
Mm.
So, I mean,
Oh,
okay.
okay. So let's go more into the meat of the conversation today. So I really want to explore with you the issues of welfare. You know, something that usually comes up in conservative circles is that welfare decimated the black family, and that so many of the problems or the issues found in the black family today can be traced to the welfare program started by Lyndon B. Johnson in the 60s. And so you grew up in that era, so you should be able to tell, and you're an economist,
Well, there's
you
no
deal with race and
question, if you go back to the 60s, about 25% of black children were born to unwed mothers. And when the sociologist Patrick Moynihan, who was working for Johnson's administration, when he talked about that being somewhat of a crisis, he was just vilified. And ultimately, he left the tenured position at Harvard. Now, ultimately, he became a senator from New York, and he remade himself into what he actually was a mainstream liberal. But this issue of the black family started to go downhill in the 70s. Now, one of the things was welfare, that you had a situation where welfare for the first time was given broadly to unmarried mothers. But there also was a kind of the beginnings of the collapse of manufacturing. So while welfare had a modest impact on reducing marriage rates, you had the beginnings of a black underclass as manufacturing declined. A statistic that I often give is in 1975 in the Midwest, which is the manufacturing heartland, 40% of young blacks worked in manufacturing, young black men. By 1990, it was 10%. So there's a real collapse of employment in manufacturing. And there were a number of reasons for it, but so what I'm saying is that while welfare contributed to it, there were other things like the collapse of manufacturing, the crack cocaine epidemic in the 80s, that led to by 1990, 67% of black children were born to unwed mothers. So it went from 25 to 67. And welfare had a part in it. What the problem is today with welfare is that the Democrats in the United States are committed to giving income transfers with no strings attached. That is, you want to get food stamps, you want to get a child tax credit, we want to give you money, but we're not going to require anything of you. We're not going to require that you be in a work readiness program. If you have mental problems, we're not going to require that you have to be in therapy. That it's no strings attached. And an example I give is food stamps. 10% of food stamps in the United States are spent on sugary soda. There was a movement to not allow food stamps to be used for it. Michelle Obama refused to participate in that campaign. She refused because it was paternalistic. It was going to be telling black families that we're not going to let you do something because we think it's bad for you. And it doesn't matter what you want, we're going to be your parents. So, there are a number of reasons why liberals just do not want to put any personal responsibility on aid that's given. And that's what I think is a key problem with these income transfers.
Okay. But as the way it is currently, is it that there are no conditions, there are no preconditions for giving out these welfare programs, these assistances to people? Don't they have to give proof of looking for a job or something like
That's
that?
unemployment insurance, but not if you're getting cash welfare, which actually relatively few people are getting now, cash welfare, because 25 years ago, welfare reform was passed, and it really severely limited. There was work readiness requirements. And so once those things were, and there was a 5-year limit on how many years you could get welfare, cash welfare. So now what goes under welfare is something called an earned income tax credit, which is your wages are supplemented. But that you have to work to get that. But there's something called a child tax credit, which you don't have to work to get. It used to be that it was the more you work, the more you got. Under the reform last year, the Biden administration, for the first time, you could get the full child credit, which they increased to 3,000 or so a child. You could get it even if you have zero wage income. Uh, Now, it wasn't renewed, but, and now it's back to the old system where for every dollar you earn, you get 25 cents of your available child credit. So there's a work incentive to get it. Uh, but food stamps, there's no requirement. Even there was a whole issue with adults with no children getting food stamps. If you're over 25, you can, and single, no dependents, you can get food stamps. There was a whole issue of putting a work readiness requirement on that, where either you have to be in a program or training or something. And Democrats don't want that. So under Obama, it was canceled. Uh, so food stamps and child credit uh, don't require work. Um,
Okay, that seems interesting. So, my other question is the welfare programs that were instituted in the 60s, and which you said part of it was responsible for what's happening in the black communities, not all of it, part of it
Certainly in the
uh,
70s, you know,
started in the 70s.
the increase from 25% to 35, 40%, a lot of that was welfare. But the increase from 40 to 70 was much more, uh, you know, the collapse of black male employment and the crack cocaine epidemic in the 90s, in the 80s had much more to do with it.
So my question is, those programs were not specifically race based; they were more socioeconomic based, right?
Yes, yes. And
So why
go ahead.
Yeah, so why did it have a disproportional impact on black families? I mean, there were white families too that were poor, um, that fit that criteria. Why did it take such a big toll on the black family as compared to other racial groups?
Well, because white families were still two-parent families. You know, the marriage rate up until 2000, you know, less than 10% of white kids were born to unmarried mothers. So I think this unmarried women with children was much more prevalent in the black community. And once jobs for black men became more problematic, whether because no manufacturing or them getting involved in the drug trade in the 80s, once you had an increasingly cohort, it's not all black men at all, but once you have an increasing cohort of problematic black men, it it's different. You know, in the white community, white men kept their manufacturing jobs by and large. Uh, so, you know, because where manufacturing was really hurt was in the inner city, in the suburban rings about around cities. They built industrial parks, and white workers could get there, but blacks who lived in the central city couldn't. So, you know, was that done for racial reasons? I used to think so, and I still think to some degree companies were looking for a way to get around hiring black men. And, you know, because they were much more, you know, militant. They wouldn't put up with crap as much as, particularly Latinos. As you started getting Latino movement into the United States in the 70s and 80s, you see all kinds of manufacturing establishments one are moving to the suburbs so they can hire whites, but even the ones that remained in the cities increasingly began to hire Latinos. So, you know, you have a bunch of things that led to there being many more problematic black men who couldn't support a family, and you you end up welfare grows from 3.5 million in the 70s to 4 million to over 5 million by 1990. You know, uh, you have this issue of not having black men, have stable employment, and women still having kids. You know, teen birth rates for blacks in 1993, in that one year, 22% of black women 15 to 19, 22% of that group got pregnant, and half of them had live births. So you had, and that teen birth rate for blacks is double the white rate. So, you know, you have a constellation of dynamics in the 80s and 90s where welfare traps women. You have lack of birth control that just accentuates the problem. And it was just unfortunate.
Okay. So now I want to get the order of things. I want to get it much more clearer. The loss of jobs for black men, the welfare state, expansion of the welfare state, and the marriage rates dropping. These three things, which came first? In what order did they come? And the
Well, I
one
don't
that
think
come
it
first
matters because
affects
I
the
don't
other.
think one caused the others necessarily. But, you know, the
Okay.
marriage rate and welfare came before the drop in male employment. But, you know, as I said, by 1980, there was this substantial drop in male employment. And then you got the cocaine in the mid 80s that siphoned off a lot of young black men into the drug trade. So you have, I mean, to some extent, this is pretty depressing, one. And what's at issue is, has that created an explanation for the problems today, right? Because there's all kinds of historical stuff. The 1619 Project is saying it's all about slavery. You know, if you want to know what's going on today, it's because of slavery. Here we're getting in a situation where there was a kind of economic and social collapse in the black community from 1965 to 1995. And the question is, does that explain anything today? Right? I mean, it's not unimportant to know this stuff, but I don't think it overly explains things today. Uh, because after the period from 1995 through for the next decade, things really picked up. Black women were successful in their transition from welfare. They still had kids out of wedlock, but they transitioned from welfare to work. Uh, Black male employment increased significantly. Wasn't the greatest jobs, but it increased. So I think that the black community, particularly the women, were very adaptable. And I mean, that's why, you know, black women in the United States have been relatively successful in getting at least associate's degrees, if not college degrees. So there, it's really men that I think it's, as I said, all men are having trouble, working class men. But it's particularly difficult for black men because I think while black women have gotten employment, schooling, and so on, it's still complicated raising kids as a single mother, particularly if you hook up with problematic men. So I think that's much more what holds back black boys is that you now have families in flux because not enough black men are in stable employment situations. And so women, there's this family churning where they hook up with one guy, have a kid, he's problematic, he's gone. They hook up with another guy, have another kid. So you have a lot of these step families, but they're chaotic. They're not stable. And that really affects boys much more than girls. It affects boys. So I think, is that related to the 60s and 70s and 80s and welfare reform? Who knows? But all we know is that there are too many black men who are not in stable employment situations, and they're problematic fathers and stepfathers. And that impacts on boys. And I think there's a lot of evidence now that this gun culture has very deep effects, not simply on getting hooked up in this culture and eventually going to jail or getting killed or whatever. But if you're an 8-year-old kid and you're living in a neighborhood where there's this gun violence, it's pretty traumatic. And there's all kinds of evidence that it affects their schooling and behavior living in neighborhoods with gun violence. So, gun violence went down substantially from up until about 2015. It went down substantially, but it's not going down today. It's at record levels. And unless that gun violence is dealt with, you got a lot of young kids who are just traumatized. It's not by the police. This whole bullshit that black kids are afraid of police. You know, they don't like the police and they might get shoved around when they shouldn't. But it's that gun violence which is really damaging them when they're 7, 8, 9 years old. And the kind of bullying that goes on in school where they feel they have to fight. And when they get to be a teenager, they need to have a gun so nobody pushes them around. I mean, it's a really harsh male culture in poor neighborhoods, poor black neighborhoods, that has nothing to do with white supremacy. Uh, and I think that has to be dealt with on its own terms. And whether it had any relationship to 20 years ago welfare, I think that's not a very helpful uh,
Okay.
view.
So you say that has nothing to do with white supremacy, but if you have a situation where poor white communities are not plagued by these same pathologies, there is not a rampant um, gun violence problem and all of the things.
Well,
Why is it the
but there's
case
a
with poor black communities? How did the guns get into those communities in the first place?
say it again. Why
So I
black
said
community?
yes. Why these same pathologies? Why don't you find them in poor white communities? If you say white supremacy is not the cause of it, why are the issues starkly different between poor black communities and poor white communities?
Well, because they get hooked on opioids, and but the issue of gun violence, where a lot of the gun violence in the U.S., the majority has nothing to do with gangs and committing crimes. It has to do with somebody pissed you off. You're not going to take this shit from that person. He said something about my girlfriend. I wasn't invited to this party. There's a lot of that. There's just a distinct black male subculture that's not in the white community. So that when these white men drift off from stability, they don't have jobs, they don't have girlfriends, they go, they just take drugs, they play video games. Uh, they just don't have that edge that's in the black community, where a slightest kind of grievance can lead to violence. I mean, that's why this Will Smith thing was not some marginal thing. It reinforced a certain view of black men that, we're not going to take that shit, and we're going to resort to violence. So, I mean, you have that in New York and other cities now. You have all of these street violence. Some of it is guns, but a good deal of it is homeless people who have mental problems. But you would think that every homeless person in New York was a black person if you looked at the news, because they're the ones that are beating up an Asian woman, smacking down a Hasidic Jew. You know, you I I don't want to go off on this, but I think there's a kind of subculture that impacts on a modest number of low income black men, where there's a macho violence as a default for dealing with conflict or when you're pissed off. And it's just troubling.
So, Thomas Sowell would say that a lot of these kinds of behavior come from hillbilly white culture. There is a certain part of uh, um, I think in his book, think Black Rednecks and White, I've forgotten the title. He made the case that this what you call the black subculture is actually came from a certain part of England and all that, from even from white people. Is there any veracity to that, or where do you think this culture comes from?
I don't know.
This
There's this
culture of I'm
argument
not
that
going to
it,
take
it,
that shit.
it there's like this honor culture where whites used to fight duels over trivial crap, and this kind of honor culture. And I mean, I I don't know why it's there, and I'm not sure it would help solving it. But the main thing is there's an incredible avoidance of dealing with this. So, for example, school policies, 3 to 4 times the rate of black suspensions is 3 to 4 times the white rate. Immediately, the notion is it's racist teachers and racist schools. Not even looking into the household. So, there's just an avoidance of looking at it, and until we start to look at it seriously, how much of it is these these chaotic families? How much of it is the gun violence they see all around them? Uh, this whole notion of bullying. Uh, there's until we take it seriously. I'm not, I'd be the last person qualified to speculate on this. But what I'm saying is, this is a serious issue in explaining a black underclass of men, is how they deal with conflict. And, um, and what's depressing is nobody, uh, other than maybe on the right wing, are even willing to admit that it's there, that everything is white supremacy, implicit bias. And I mean, I'm trying to get published a paper that where there's a group of academics in New York City who interviewed 250 black boy adolescents, 16 and 17 years old, who carry guns. And it was just the most apologistic explanations for why we should feel, we should see these kids as victims. We shouldn't enforce gun laws. And the fact, I talked to somebody about carjackings. In Philadelphia, there was a carjacking of a congresswoman. Uh, and I spoke to somebody who said, well, it shows how desperate black young men are. Not that there's something wrong with with what they're doing, but it's just a manifestation of poverty and racism that they do this. That's how do you answer people like that? I mean, it's what they think and what they believe, and they're just unwilling to look at what's going to improve the behavior of these young black men so that they can succeed.
Okay, but what if I was to make this argument that the reason why this black culture, black subculture, even developed in the first place was because of segregation, lack of opportunities to black communities, redlining, Jim Crow, and all those other things, and such that they found themselves in a very tough, hostile environment, and it was survival of the fittest, and this just became a culture. So can't we trace it back to the the history of oppression and suppression that black people have um, gone through in America to explain why these things are happening? I'm not saying it's
Well,
an
you can.
excuse, but it's a possible explanation, don't you think?
Well, um, there's an argument. Cornel West, who's a liberal left black thought person, he says that there's just a nihilistic attitude among blacks that, after generation of ending up in the same place that your parents were, living in the same crumbling neighborhoods, that they have just a nihilistic attitude. And it then leads them to lash out. And who they're going to lash out at? They're going to go into some white neighborhood and kill some whites. They live in these neighborhoods and they just do it in their to people they know who piss them off. Uh, and, so there's certainly an argument that sees this intergenerational deep poverty. Again, it's a subsection of, we're talking about maybe 20% of the black population. We're not talking at most. We're talking about a particular small segment. And now they drive behaviors, because if you live in one of those neighborhoods and you got these kind of kids, you're going to have to be a tough ass yourself and not to be taken advantage of. So it kind of snowballs into affecting many more people who, just for their own self survival, have to take on a certain demeanor. But, uh, again, I think the problem is public policy from the Democrats. You can't talk about this. What I'm saying, if if this gets out, they're going to be people are going to say that Jerry is a racist, right? I mean, the world we live in, and so hopefully none of my friends will see this. Uh, but it it's just impossible to put any blame on these black young men who have very difficult lives. Growing up in chaotic families, going to not necessarily the best schools, not having the best diet, having gunshots in their neighborhood, traumatizing them. They could be sympathetic people. And so it's a fine line between saying that they should not be allowed to do what they're doing and being sympathetic to why they're in those situations. And uh, and so I think, particularly if you have the more conservative people who say, who have no sympathy for them at all, and just want to say, we should go back to throwing 16 and 17-year-olds in jail, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a very difficult environment to say what should be done. And what I'm saying is we should at least be aware that this is an important issue. And then we can begin to look at what can be done about it. But we're not even at that stage to look to what can be done about it, because it's not there.
Okay, but don't you think that it's because of a lack of opportunities in these communities? If there are no jobs, if there are no infrastructure, if the education is crappy,
I
and
don't think
all
that.
that.
So, for
Okay.
example, black the the employment rate, the share who are working in paid employment of black men 16 to 19, what's called teen employment, is at record levels in the United States now. So if you're a 16, 17, 18-year-old black kid and you want to get a job and you present yourself in a way that an employer will say, I'm going to take a chance on this kid. If you come well dressed and talk in an appropriate way, you can get jobs. Now, you're not going to be a millionaire, but you can get jobs. Much of what I write about now is that the problem is liberals want to force everyone into a 4-year college degree track. Everyone should go, when probably at least half, but probably 3/4 of black high school graduates don't have college skills. So they flunk out. You have about a quarter of black men, 25 to 29, have been to college but have no degrees. So I think occupational tracks, some of them are pretty decent. Certificate programs, there's a whole range of tracks in occupations that are viable for people who have weak academic skills. And particularly these certificate programs lead to stable full-time employment. So I think one of the major problems for this country is that liberal policy is to force everyone into 4-year academic tracks, either in community college where they do their first 2 years and go on to the 4-year college. I mean, uh, and it's just impossible for a substantial number of those high school graduates to go on from high school into an academic track and be successful. Now, they could get a certificate program when they're 18 and 19, and when they're in their mid 20s, they have more maturity, they have experience, then they can go back to college. But to throw 18 and 19-year-old kids with these weak academic skills into academic tracks is like putting a gun to their head. Now but all these liberals think they're doing wonders because they're giving everyone the opportunity for a 4-year degree.
So,
Sorry.
yeah, sorry. So my question is, why are blacks performing so poorly academically? Is it that they're not getting a good educational foundation? Because if they are getting the same, I see this as a foundational problem. Probably their earliest years of education, the background is not solid. So you're not going to expect such people to do very well when they get to college and all that. So what's happening? Are the schools not funded properly, or are the quality of the teachers not good? What's
Schools are
happening
funded probably. New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, LA are the most heavily funded schools. Now, they're not funded as much as suburban schools, but they're funded very strongly. That's not the problem. The problem is that they come from these problematic families. They come from these neighborhoods where there's gun violence that leads to a certain level of trauma. And there are not support services that go into the families. What is needed is much more social services that go directly into the household. They give advice to parents. A lot of these, we're talking about, a 23-year-old, 24-year-old woman having her first kid. She's not that educated. She don't know that. She's coming from a broken family often. She doesn't know exactly what to do. So there are nursing programs where people go in and they help these young mothers shape out a strategy for raising their kid and moving their own lives ahead. And then there are programs for 4 to 6 year olds that make them school ready. I'm not talking about required uh, childcare. I'm talking about in the family, because you have to get up to snuff the parents in what parenting should be to get their kids on track. Again, this is paternalistic. Liberals don't like it. You're going into these and you're telling these people that this is what you should be doing. Now, the fact is, a lot of these programs are successful because the parents want that. They're getting services that are helpful to them. But from the liberal standpoint, you're being paternalistic. You're imposing values on these people. So that's
so
what has to change. And there's also the whole issue of charter schools in the United States. Charter schools are incredibly effective because they're no nonsense. They don't allow behavioral problems that the public school does. And they also engage the parents in ways that the public school doesn't. I give in this book that I'm finishing up, I give the example of, let's say you want to go and do exercises. You're overweight, you're whatever. You want to do exercises. It ends up, however much you want to do it, things get in the way, except if you get a trainer. If you go to a gym and you have a trainer, that trainer gets you to fulfill your aspiration. And that's what charter schools do. They're the trainers of the parents. And they get these parents to be the kind of parents that they want to be. But you can't do that in the public school system. It's paternalistic. It's and you got the craziness in the. So if you look at performance in charter schools, they're dramatically better than the traditional public schools. So the approach in this country is to stop funding charter schools. Biden has a new bill. The federal government modestly funds charters. They've changed the conditions for charters to get it that essentially won't allow charters to get it. I mean, they've set up rules that you can only have a charter where you have schools that are overcrowded, so that the charter is a supplement. In poor neighborhoods, those schools aren't overcrowded. Parents are fleeing those schools. But now under Biden, his new rule, you couldn't set up a charter school in those neighborhoods. So, I think liberals are criminal. Black parents want charters. No, they are, because Black parents and Latino parents, they want charter schools. Liberals don't, and the teachers union don't. Black parents want more cops in the neighborhood. Liberals don't. And, so in the name of helping people, you don't give a shit what they think. You know what's best. But somehow, what I've described as being paternalistic. What they're describing is just social justice policies. I'm getting depressed here. I'm going to have to get a drink pretty soon.
Oh, no problem. I think we might even we might end shortly. But okay, now let me see if we can do a thought experiment. You feel that these liberal policies, democratic liberal policies, are the ones that are responsible for some of this decay.
That's right.
So now, I don't think that all black cities are run by Democrats. Is that the case? Is it the case that all black cities are run by Democrats?
I
Is there
think
no
almost all of the
Republican run?
larger cities are. The,
Is
the
there no
top
Republican
50,
run
I would say
majority black city?
if you took the 50 cities, largest cities in the United States, 75 largest, I would say that 95% of the mayors are black. So you could have a handful that aren't. But I mean, I think that's irrelevant. I don't think that that's particularly relevant, because you can have black mayors who are effective. I mean, in Houston, you have a pretty reasonably effective. In New York City now, you have Eric Adams. So I don't think it's race per se, but it's politics. So even in cities
No,
where you might have a white, if it's one of these like San Francisco, it's not going to be helpful whether the person is white or black, given the politics that they have.
yeah, my question wasn't even about race. My question was about the political parties. What are the measurable differences in Republican run majority black areas as opposed to Democrat run um, majority black areas? That's what
Well,
I wanted to see,
in
if
areas
it's
that are
the liberal
Republican
policies that actually follow.
run, you have obviously much more sympathy with charter schools and private schools. So that's helpful. The other thing is that during the pandemic, they didn't close down their schools. That's most famously in Florida with DeSantis. Florida schools were open throughout the entire pandemic. And rather than having the disastrous impact of closing down schools in the major urban areas run by liberals. Because they weren't getting any education. They didn't have any ability to go on Zoom. Teachers weren't trained to do Zoom. It was criminal what was done in the name of protecting teachers. That's who it was. Wasn't, kids never were at a high incident of getting a serious COVID. At least in the United States, there less kids under 17 died from COVID than died in a typical flu season. So, uh, so I think those are two of the major differences over the in the past. Uh, but I don't, and I think they're also much more Republican or less liberal cities are much more attuned to occupational training in high school that leads to um, vocational programs post high school, post secondary. Uh,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So if you or my friends would like to ask you questions directly, so do you mind if I let them in and
Okay.
ask you some questions?
We're
Okay.
running
So
a
let me
little
put the
long
link.
here, but okay.
Yeah. So the link is up. Cody, you can call in. So he was making a point about when we're talking about the differences between racialized poor white communities and racialized poor black communities. He was making the case that that it's similar, that the behaviors and the patterns are that they are similar. So I wanted him to come and expand that point and see how um, what we can make of it, what we can make of that point. Well, however, in terms of welfare policies, in what ways do you think welfare can work? In what ways do you think that the current welfare programs can be improved upon to benefit um, racialized black communities?
Well, I think again there are welfare policies now in the U.S. The dominant welfare policies are this child tax credit, food stamps, and this thing called the earned income tax credit. I think that what can be done is make sure that these programs don't stand in the way of work and don't stand in the way of getting training for work. Um, and there are ways that they can be improved to make work readiness and employment much more a focal of these programs. Certainly, training programs. The government runs a whole bunch of training programs, but not for the population that we're talking about. Uh, for example, you cannot get student aid for certificate programs. So a program that train you get you a certificate. If you go to a community college, you can get student support. If you go to a 4-year college, you can get student support. But if you're going a trade route, an occupational route, which is not in credit bearing, college credit bearing, the government won't give you any aid. So that's an important area in which a change in funding and support uh, can have a big difference. Um,
Okay. Okay. So my last question before anyone comes in, or if not, we might just go ahead and end the stream. So my last question is the war on drugs. What do you make of the war on drugs?
it there's no more any war on drugs. It hasn't been a war on drugs for 15 years. The vast majority of blacks who are in prison are there for felonies for violent crimes. Less than 10% are there solely for a drug related crime. That wasn't true 20 years ago, but that's the situation today. So that, uh, and also the black population in prison in the United States has been almost halved. So this idea that prisons are the new Jim Crow, this Michelle Alexander book of 12, 13 years ago, has no relevance today.
All right, Professor Sherry, thank you very much for coming to have this conversation with us today. And there's so much that I really want to talk to you about, and I hope you will do us the honor of coming back again so we can talk about other issues. I really want to explore the gender angle in terms of earning disparities, both racially and gender wise, and to see know what the truth of the current narratives is, and from an economics perspective, what the truth really is. So I really appreciate you for coming to have this conversation with us today. Thank you
Well, it
very
was
much,
my
sir.
pleasure, and I can now go get my drink. Take care.
Yes, sir, you can. All right, sir. Bye.
Bye. I didn't know if you realized it was almost my. Yes, I do.
All right, guys, so that's the conversation with Professor Robert Cherry. um I was hoping Steve and Cody or someone else was going to call in and ask him a question. I was particularly interested in the point where Cody made that he probably hasn't met the poor white people that he has met. So it's possible that the pathologies in poor black communities may not be as different from those in poor white communities. I don't know because I don't live in the US, but I really want to see if that is true. And I want to understand the dynamics. Why is it different? Why when similar socioeconomic conditions are present, but the behavioral patterns are different? So what's driving it? What's the driving force behind it? And even though we didn't get to talk much about welfare, but I think it was still an overall good conversation. So I want to thank you all for coming to the stream today, and I hope to see you soon in another live stream. So it's bye for now. Have a great day.